Behind the dim hallway of Willow Creek Recovery Home, Marine Caleb Ward stood frozen beside his loyal K9 Atlas as he watched a scene no son should ever see. His elderly father, Thomas, sat trembling in a wheelchair while the woman the entire town trusted gripped his bruised wrist and forced a pen into his shaking hand. Then Atlas erupted into furious barking. Across the room, another old man sat strapped tightly to a wheelchair, his wrists dark purple beneath the restraints, fear filling his eyes like a prisoner waiting to be forgotten. Caleb had survived war overseas, but nothing prepared him for the horror hiding inside this quiet rehab center. If you believe no elderly person deserves to suffer in silence, stay with this story. Snow drifted quietly across Pine Hollow, Idaho. The town looked exactly the way postcards described small mountain towns in winter. White rooftops, smoke curling from chimneys, frozen pine trees standing guard around narrow roads. Warm yellow lights glowing through frosted windows. From a distance it looked peaceful, safe, the kind of place where bad things didn't happen, the kind of place people trusted. Caleb Ward knew better. Bad things happened everywhere. They simply wore different faces depending on where you found them. The old Ford pickup rumbled down Highway 12 as snowflakes danced through the headlights. The truck wasn't much to look at. Rust covered sections of the wheel wells. The driver's door squeaked every time it opened. The heater only worked when it felt like cooperating. But Caleb kept it running anyway, because it had belonged to his father, and some things weren't measured by value. They were measured by memory. At 42, Gunnery Sergeant Caleb Ward carried himself the same way he'd carried himself for most of his adult life. Back straight, eyes alert. Hands steady, years of Marine service had turned awareness into instinct. He noticed everything. Road conditions, vehicle positions, movement, behavior. The habits never left. Not after Afghanistan, not after Iraq, not after 20 years spent surviving places where hesitation got people killed. Beside him sat Atlas. The German Shepherd occupied nearly half the cab. 8 years old, 85 pounds of muscle, discipline, and intelligence. The dog wore no vest now, no military markings, no service insignia, yet there was no mistaking what he had once been. Atlas carried himself like a soldier. Because that's exactly what he was. Caleb glanced toward him. The dog's amber eyes stared through the windshield, focused, watching, always watching. Almost there. Atlas flicked one ear, acknowledging the statement, nothing more. The dog wasn't much for conversation, neither was Caleb. The pair had spent 6 years together overseas, long enough to understand each other without words, long enough to trust each other completely, long enough to become family. The thought brought Caleb back to why he was driving through a snowstorm toward Willow Creek Recovery Home in the first place. Family, his father, Thomas Ward, 79 years old, former mechanic, former business owner, former mountain of a man, now recovering from a stroke. The reality still felt strange. Growing up, Caleb had believed his father was indestructible. Thomas Ward could repair engines nobody else could fix. Lift equipment younger men struggled to move, work 14-hour days and still come home smiling. He'd been the strongest man Caleb knew. Then time did what time always does. It collected its debt. One year the old mechanic complained about feeling tired. The next came dizziness, then hospital visits. Then a stroke, now Willow Creek. Life changed fast, too fast. The recovery home appeared through the snowfall. Warm yellow lights glowed from the windows. The building sat surrounded by pine trees, its stone exterior looking more like a lodge than a medical facility. The wooden sign outside looked welcoming. Hand-painted flowers decorated the corners. A slogan curved across the center, compassion in every step. Caleb read it twice. Then parked. Atlas stared at the building, not moving. The Marine noticed immediately. "What is it?" The dog didn't respond, but something had changed. His ears rose slightly. His breathing slowed, every muscle became alert. Then came the growl. Quiet, deep, barely audible, but unmistakable. Caleb frowned. Atlas almost never growled, not without reason. The dog had ignored explosions overseas, ignored gunfire, ignored screaming crowds, yet somehow a rehabilitation center in Idaho had his attention. Interesting, very interesting. The truck engine died. Snow whispered against the windshield. Atlas continued staring, watching, waiting. Caleb stepped out first. Cold air slapped his face. The smell of snow and pine filled his lungs. Atlas jumped down beside him, immediately positioning himself closer than usual. Another thing Caleb noticed. The dog normally explored new environments. Not today. Today he stayed glued to Caleb's leg. The automatic doors opened with a soft mechanical hum. Warm air rushed outward. The smell hit immediately. Disinfectant, coffee, soup, cleaning chemicals, institutional air. Caleb had smelled it in military hospitals around the world. Every building like this smelled the same. Inside, Christmas decorations still hung near the reception desk despite the holiday being weeks past. A television murmured quietly in the corner. Soft music played through hidden speakers. Everything looked pleasant. Everything looked normal. Atlas growled again. The receptionist looked up. Elaine Mercer rose from behind the desk with practiced grace. Her smile arrived instantly. Perfect, professional, comforting, the kind of smile designed to calm worried families. "Sergeant Ward," her voice sounded warm, "we've been expecting you." Caleb shook her hand, brief, firm, polite, nothing more. "How's my father?" Elaine's smile never moved. "Oh, Thomas is doing much better." The answer arrived quickly, too quickly. "Physical therapy has been helping." She stepped around the desk. "He's still adjusting emotionally, of course." Another smile. "That's completely normal." Atlas moved slightly in front of Caleb. Not enough to be obvious, enough for Caleb to notice. The dog stared directly at Elaine, then beyond her, down the hallway toward the deeper sections of the building. His ears remained rigid, focused, listening. Elaine noticed. Only for a second, then her smile returned. "Protective, isn't he?" "Very." The administrator laughed softly. "Good dog." Atlas didn't react, he simply kept watching. That bothered Caleb because Atlas liked people, most people. The dog wasn't aggressive. He wasn't suspicious without cause. Something had his attention, and whatever it wasn't Elaine herself. It was something deeper inside Willow Creek. Something hidden, something unseen. "Thomas is in room 214. Elaine gestured toward the hallway. "Follow me." The corridor stretched ahead beneath soft, yellow lighting. Framed photographs lined the walls, residents smiling, staff celebrating birthdays, group activities, happy moments. A carefully constructed image of comfort. Yet as Caleb walked, he noticed other things, things cameras never photographed. An elderly woman sitting alone beside a window. No visitors, no conversation, just silence. A thin man staring at the floor while clutching a blanket. A nurse rushing past without making eye contact. Fear, not obvious fear, subtle fear. The kind that hid inside posture, inside expressions, inside silence. Years of military service taught Caleb one simple truth. People always revealed more than they intended. You simply had to watch. Room 214 waited near the end of the corridor. Elaine opened the door. "There he is." Thomas Ward sat beside the window. For a moment, Caleb forgot how to breathe, because every visit showed the same thing, and every visit hurt. The old mechanic looked smaller, weaker, frailer. His once broad shoulders had narrowed. His silver hair had thinned. His hands trembled even while resting on the armrests. This wasn't the father Caleb remembered. This was time winning. "Hey, Dad." Thomas looked up. His tired blue eyes brightened immediately. "There he is." The old man's smile appeared, small, real. The first genuine smile Caleb had seen all day, and for a moment everything else disappeared. The hallway, the staff, the strange feeling, all of it. Because no matter how old he became, Thomas Ward was still his father. And Caleb was still his son. Atlas crossed the room immediately. The German shepherd rested his head against Thomas's knee. The old mechanic laughed softly. "There he is." His trembling hand moved through the dog's fur. "Still keeping everyone safe?" Atlas closed his eyes briefly, accepting the affection. Thomas scratched behind one ear. The shepherd leaned closer. For the first time since arriving, he looked relaxed. Almost, but not completely. Because even while accepting attention, Atlas continued watching the room, watching the hallway, watching everything. And somewhere deep inside Caleb's instincts, a warning began taking shape. A quiet warning, a dangerous warning, the kind that had kept him alive overseas. Something inside Willow Creek Recovery Home wasn't right, and Atlas had noticed it before anyone else. Thomas's hand remained resting on Atlas's head. The old mechanic smiled as the German shepherd leaned gently against his wheelchair. For a moment, Caleb allowed himself to relax, just a little. Seeing his father's smile still carried the same effect it always had. It reminded him that Thomas Ward was still there, still fighting, still himself, even if age and illness had taken pieces along the way. "You look tired." Thomas snorted. "You sound like your mother." That earned a laugh, a real one. The old mechanic smiled proudly. "See." He pointed a trembling finger. "Still got it." Caleb pulled a chair closer. "How's therapy going?" The smile faded slightly, not completely, just enough. "It's fine." The answer arrived too quickly. Another thing Caleb noticed. His father had never been good at lying, not when Caleb was a child, not now. "Fine." Thomas nodded. "Yep." Silence. The Marine studied him carefully. Years ago, before deployment interviews and intelligence briefings, Caleb had learned something from his father. People often answered questions with words. The truth usually appeared somewhere else, in their eyes, their hands, their posture, their hesitation. Thomas's fingers tightened slightly around Atlas's collar, a tiny movement, easy to miss. "Not for Caleb. What's wrong?" The old mechanic looked toward the window. Snow drifted outside, peaceful, quiet, safe. The room felt different, heavier. Thomas swallowed, then forced another smile. "Nothing." There it was, definitely a lie. Before Caleb could press further, a nurse appeared in the doorway, young. Maybe 25. Dark hair pulled into a bun, tired eyes. She stopped abruptly when she noticed Caleb. Then her gaze moved toward Atlas, then toward Thomas. Something flashed across her face. Concern, fear, gone almost instantly, but not fast enough. "Medication time." Her voice sounded rehearsed. Thomas's shoulders visibly tensed. That reaction bothered Caleb immediately. The nurse approached, carrying a small paper cup. The old mechanic accepted it without complaint, without question, without even looking. Atlas stood, instantly. The German shepherd moved between Thomas and the nurse, not aggressively, not threateningly, but deliberately. The nurse froze. The room went silent. Caleb looked down. Atlas stared directly at the medication cup, his ears forward, his body rigid, focused. The nurse laughed nervously. "He's protective." No one answered because Atlas wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the pills. That detail changed everything. The nurse shifted uncomfortably, then looked toward Caleb. "Could you?" The Marine reached down and rested one hand on Atlas's shoulder. The dog obeyed immediately, moving aside, yet his eyes never left the cup, not once. Thomas swallowed the medication. The nurse quickly left, too quickly. The second she disappeared, Atlas moved to the doorway, watching, listening, waiting. Caleb's stomach tightened. Something was definitely wrong. The question was what, and more importantly, how bad? "Dad." Thomas didn't answer. "Look at me." The old mechanic hesitated, then slowly turned. Caleb immediately saw it. The bruise, faint, mostly hidden beneath the sleeve of his father's shirt, dark purple, old enough to be healing, large enough to matter. The Marine's expression hardened. "What happened to your arm?" Thomas looked down, then quickly pulled the sleeve lower. "Nothing. That's not nothing." Silence. The old mechanic stared toward the floor. Atlas returned to the wheelchair, resting beside him, protective, alert. The room suddenly felt very small, very quiet. Finally, Thomas sighed. The sound carried exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying something alone. "They move people sometimes." Caleb waited. The old mechanic continued staring downward. "Some of the orderlies." A pause. "They get impatient." The Marine's jaw tightened. "Impatient." Thomas nodded slowly, no eye contact, no details, just enough information to make things worse, not better. "Did someone grab you?" Silence. "Dad." Another silence. Then finally, "Drop it." The words came out sharper than expected. Immediately, Thomas looked regretful. The old mechanic rubbed one trembling hand across his face. "I'm tired, son." A pause, just tired. Caleb sat back, thinking, observing, analyzing, the way he'd done throughout 20 years of service. His father was scared, not nervous, scared. And that frightened Caleb more than anything he'd seen so far, because Thomas Ward wasn't afraid of people, never had been, not bosses, not bullies, not anyone, if something had made him afraid. Then something serious was happening inside Willow Creek. The television mounted on the wall continued playing quietly. Some daytime game show, bright lights, laughing contestants, normal life. The contrast felt disturbing, like watching a comedy inside a burning building. A movement in the hallway caught Caleb's attention. A wheelchair. An elderly man being pushed toward another corridor. The man's wrists were visible. Dark marks circled both arms, not bruises, something else, pressure marks, as though restraints had been used recently. The man looked terrified, not confused, not disoriented, terrified. For a brief moment their eyes met. The old man's expression changed instantly. Hope, then fear, then silence. He looked away. The orderly pushing him noticed Caleb watching. Their eyes met. The orderly immediately turned the wheelchair down another hallway, out of sight. Gone. Caleb slowly stood. Thomas noticed. "Where are you going?" "Bathroom." A lie. The old mechanic knew it immediately. His shoulders tightened. Caleb. The Marine looked back. For a moment, father and son simply stared at each other. Then Thomas quietly said something that made the room colder. Be careful. Not don't go, not leave it alone, not mind your own business, be careful. Those two words confirmed everything. Because they meant Thomas knew something. Something serious, something dangerous, something he wasn't ready to say aloud. Caleb nodded once, then stepped into the hallway. Atlas followed immediately. The German shepherd remained close enough that his shoulder occasionally brushed Caleb's leg. The corridor stretched ahead beneath soft yellow lights. Everything still looked pleasant, everything still looked normal. And suddenly that bothered Caleb more than if the place looked terrible, because evil rarely announced itself. Real evil hid behind smiles, policies, paperwork, professional language. It hid behind people who looked trustworthy. The hallway branched near the nurse's station. Voices drifted from a nearby office. Caleb slowed. Instinct, training, the voices became clearer. One belonged to Elaine, the administrator. The other belonged to a man, older, angry. Can't keep happening. Silence. Then Elaine answered. Her warm, public voice was gone. This version sounded cold, sharp. Controlled, you'll follow procedure. The man lowered his voice. I don't care about procedure. A pause. Somebody's going to notice. Caleb stopped walking. Atlas froze beside him. Every muscle in the shepherd's body became rigid, listening. The Marine moved closer, carefully. The conversation continued. Family visits increasing. The man's voice, concerned, nervous, then Elaine. Which is why records must match. Silence, do you understand? The word sent a chill down Caleb's spine. Records match what? The man didn't answer immediately. Finally, yes. Elaine's voice softened slightly, almost soothing. Good. Footsteps moving, coming closer. Caleb immediately stepped away from the office door, turning casually toward a nearby bulletin board. Atlas mirrored the movement. Seconds later, the office opened. Elaine emerged. A middle-aged man followed. Neither looked happy. The administrator noticed Caleb instantly. A smile appeared, perfect, polished, professional. As if the cold conversation never happened. Everything all right? Caleb smiled back, the same way Marines smiled during interrogations. Friendly, harmless, false. Just stretching my legs. Elaine nodded. Of course. For a second, her eyes moved toward Atlas. The dog stared directly at her, unblinking. The administrator's smile weakened slightly, only slightly, but enough. Then she walked away. The man followed, leaving Caleb alone in the hallway. Atlas remained perfectly still, watching them disappear around the corner. Then the German shepherd did something he almost never did. He growled, low, deep, dangerous. And for the first time since arriving at Willow Creek Recovery Home, Caleb stopped wondering whether something was wrong. Now he knew. The only question left was how much darkness was hiding behind those walls. Caleb waited until Elaine disappeared before moving again. The hallway suddenly felt different. The cheerful paintings, the soft music, the smiling photographs hanging on the walls, everything felt staged now, artificial, like a carefully constructed mask. Atlas stayed close as they continued walking. The German shepherd's posture had completely changed since entering Willow Creek. His tail remained low, his ears forward. Every muscle alert. The dog wasn't relaxed, he wasn't merely cautious, he was working. And that fact alone sent a warning through Caleb's mind. Atlas had spent years detecting threats before humans noticed them. Explosives, hidden weapons, ambushes, dangerous people. The dog had saved lives because he trusted his instincts. Caleb trusted them too. The corridor eventually opened into a recreation room. Several residents sat scattered around the space. A television played quietly near the far wall. An elderly woman worked on a puzzle. A thin man slept in a chair near the fireplace. Another resident stared silently out a window. Nobody looked particularly happy. Nobody looked especially engaged. Most simply looked tired, defeated, like people waiting for time to pass. Then Caleb noticed her. A woman sitting alone at a small table near the corner. White hair, sharp blue eyes, maybe 80. Maybe older. Unlike the others, she wasn't staring at the television. She was watching people, watching staff, watching everything. The same way Caleb watched people, the same way Atlas watched people. Interesting. As Caleb entered the room, her gaze shifted toward him. Then toward Atlas, something changed immediately. Recognition. Not of Caleb, of the dog. The woman slowly sat straighter. Atlas noticed her too. The German shepherd walked directly across the room, ignoring everyone else. Ignoring the television, ignoring the staff, straight toward the old woman. When he reached her chair, he stopped. Then gently rested his head against her hand. The woman froze. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then her fingers slowly moved through his fur, and suddenly tears filled her eyes. Caleb stopped walking. The reaction was immediate, powerful, unexpected. You okay? The woman laughed softly, a fragile sound. I used to have one. Her voice trembled. A shepherd. Atlas remained beside her, quiet, patient, present. The woman wiped at her eyes. He looked just like this. Caleb pulled out a chair. What's his name? The woman smiled sadly. Max. A pause. Best dog I ever knew. Atlas leaned closer. The woman scratched behind his ears, and for the first time since Caleb entered the room, she looked genuinely happy. Not polite, not pretending, happy. Caleb introduced himself. The woman nodded. Grace Bennett. They shook hands. Her grip surprised him. Strong, steady, the grip of someone who hadn't surrendered to age, not yet. You visiting someone? My father. Grace's expression shifted, subtly, not enough for most people to notice, enough for Caleb. Thomas Ward. The old woman's eyes widened slightly. You know him. Grace glanced around the room before answering, checking who might be listening. That bothered Caleb immediately, then she lowered her voice. Good man. A pause. Very good man. Another pause. Too good. The statement lingered. Caleb leaned forward. What does that mean? Grace didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked toward a nurse crossing the room, waited until she passed, then looked back. How often do you visit? The question surprised him. Whenever I can. Grace nodded slowly, then her eyes moved toward the doorway, toward the hallway, toward the deeper parts of Willow Creek. A shadow crossed her face. Fear, real fear. The same fear he'd seen in the old man with the marks on his wrists. The same fear he'd seen in Thomas. The same fear hiding behind silence. You should come more often. Caleb stared at her. Why? Grace swallowed. Her fingers stopped moving through Atlas's fur. The room suddenly felt quieter, smaller, heavier. The old woman looked directly into his eyes, and when she finally spoke, her voice barely rose above a whisper. Because things happen here when families aren't watching. Silence, the words landed like a punch, not because they were dramatic, because they sounded honest, painfully honest. Before Caleb could ask another question, a nurse entered the room. Grace immediately went silent, instantly, like a light switch. The change was so sudden it was impossible to miss. The nurse smiled pleasantly. Everything all right, Grace? The old woman returned a smile, a fake one. We're fine. The nurse nodded, then looked toward Caleb, then Atlas, then back toward Grace. For a brief moment, suspicion flickered across her face, gone almost instantly, but there, definitely there. When she finally left, Grace didn't speak again, not immediately. Instead, she stared down at the table, her hands trembling slightly. Caleb waited, patient. Finally, she whispered, They listen. His stomach tightened. Who? Grace didn't answer. The old woman simply shook her head, then stood slowly. Atlas moved aside to help her pass. She paused beside Caleb's chair and quietly slipped something into his hand. A folded piece of paper, tiny, hidden, quick. The movement was so subtle nobody else noticed, not even the staff. Then Grace walked away, leaving Caleb staring at the folded paper in his palm. Atlas watched her disappear down the hallway, then looked back at Caleb. The Marine waited until no one was paying attention, then carefully unfolded it. 3 words were written inside, shaky handwriting, barely readable, yet impossible to misunderstand. Check room 318. Caleb stared at the note. His pulse quickened. Room 318. Who was there? What was in it? Why had Grace risked passing him a secret message? The answers clearly mattered. A lot. The Marine folded the note again, slipped it into his pocket. Then looked toward the hallway, toward the upper floors of Willow Creek, toward room 318. Atlas followed his gaze. The German shepherd's ears rose immediately, as if he somehow already knew. And deep inside, Caleb felt the same certainty growing stronger. Whatever was happening inside Willow Creek Recovery Home. Room 318 was about to show him the truth. Caleb didn't go to room 318 immediately. Years of military training stopped him. Curiosity got people killed. Patience kept them alive. If Grace had risked passing him a secret note, then whatever existed in room 318 wasn't something he should charge toward blindly. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it deeper into his pocket. Then stood. Atlas rose instantly beside him. The shepherd remained unusually focused. His eyes moved constantly. Tracking staff, watching doorways, listening, working. A nearby clock ticked softly on the wall, 3:23 in the afternoon. Visiting hours still had several hours remaining. Plenty of time. Caleb returned to room 214. His father sat exactly where he'd left him, watching snow drift outside the window. The old mechanic looked over immediately. Concern appeared across his face. Where were you? The question came too quickly, too sharply. Another sign. Caleb sat down. Walking. Thomas relaxed slightly, not completely, just enough. Atlas moved beside the wheelchair. The old shepherd rested near Thomas's feet, protective, comforting. Familiar, for several minutes nobody spoke. Then Caleb decided to try a different approach. "Dad," Thomas sighed. The sound suggested he already knew what was coming. "What? Who's Grace Bennett?" The reaction was immediate. The old mechanic froze, only for a second, but it happened. And Caleb caught it, every bit of it. Thomas looked toward the hallway, then toward the closed door, then back at his son. "You met Grace?" Caleb nodded. "She seems nice." The old mechanic stared toward the floor, thinking, calculating, choosing words carefully, far too carefully. Finally he nodded. "She is." A pause was a school principal. Another pause, smart woman. Silence, Caleb waited. Thomas wasn't finished, he could tell. Eventually the old mechanic spoke again, softer this time. Smart enough to notice things. There it was. The closest thing to honesty he'd gotten all day. "What things?" Thomas didn't answer. Instead, his hands tightened on the wheelchair armrests. The room felt heavier. The old mechanic looked older suddenly, more tired, more frightened. Then he whispered something that nearly stopped Caleb's heart. "Some people disappear." Silence, absolute silence. Even Atlas lifted his head. Caleb leaned forward. "What do you mean disappear?" The old mechanic immediately regretted saying it. That much was obvious. Fear flashed across his face, real fear. Then the walls came back up, instantly. "Nothing, Dad, forget it. People don't disappear from recovery centers." Thomas laughed, a short, bitter laugh, humorless, the kind of laugh people used when reality sounded ridiculous. "You'd think so." The words hung in the air, cold, heavy, dangerous. Then came a knock, 3 sharp taps against the doorframe. Everyone turned. Elaine stood in the doorway, smiling, perfect as always, professional, warm, trustworthy. The exact image families expected, yet now Caleb saw something different. Because once suspicion entered your mind, details became impossible to ignore. The smile never reached her eyes, not once. "Thomas," her voice sounded cheerful. "We need you downstairs for evaluation." The old mechanic visibly tensed. Caleb noticed immediately, so did Atlas. The German shepherd stood. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. Elaine's smile flickered, only slightly, but enough. "Atlas doesn't seem to like me." The administrator laughed softly. Nobody joined her. Thomas lowered his eyes. The room grew quiet, uncomfortable. Finally Caleb stood. "I'll come." Elaine shook her head immediately, too quickly. "No need." The answer arrived before he even finished speaking. "Interesting, very interesting." The Marine smiled politely. "I insist." For a moment the administrator's expression hardened. Gone so fast most people would have missed it. Not Caleb, not Atlas. Then the smile returned. "Of course." The evaluation room sat on the first floor, smaller than expected. Clinical, sterile, white walls, metal cabinets, a single examination table, nothing unusual. At least at first glance. Thomas sat quietly while a therapist reviewed paperwork. Elaine remained nearby, watching, observing, managing. The entire process felt strange. The therapist barely spoke to Thomas. Instead, she asked questions and checked boxes. Routine, mechanical, detached, as if the old mechanic wasn't even present. Caleb watched silently. Atlas lay near the wall, appearing relaxed, but appearances meant nothing. The shepherd's eyes remained open, tracking everything. The evaluation continued for 15 minutes, then 20. Eventually, the therapist stepped outside, taking paperwork with her. Elaine followed. The door didn't close completely. A small gap remained. Voices drifted through, faint, muffled. Caleb wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Then he heard his father's name. Everything changed. Ward's family visits too often. The therapist, concerned, uneasy. Then Elaine, cold again, the same voice from the office earlier. "We'll manage it." Silence, then. "What about Bennett?" Caleb's pulse quickened. "Grace." The therapist lowered her voice, too low to fully hear. Then Elaine answered. "Move her." "Move her?" The phrase sent a chill through him. "Move her where? Why?" The conversation continued. Fragments only, pieces enough to build concern. Not enough for answers. Finally, footsteps approached. The voices stopped. The door opened. Elaine entered smiling, professional once again. The transformation was almost impressive, almost. The evaluation ended shortly afterward. Thomas returned to his room. Dinner approached. Staff moved through the hallways. Families began leaving. The building slowly changed. Visiting hours ending altered everything. The atmosphere shifted. The smiles became thinner. The energy different, more controlled, more guarded. Caleb noticed. Atlas definitely noticed. And somewhere between the dining room and the elevator, the Marine finally made his decision. Room 318, tonight. The third floor felt different, quieter, older. less maintained. The elevator doors opened with a mechanical groan. Caleb stepped out, Atlas beside him. The hallway stretched ahead beneath dim lighting, fewer decorations, fewer residents, fewer staff. A strange silence filled the floor. The room numbers climbed steadily. The farther they walked, the more isolated the corridor became. Then Atlas stopped. Suddenly, completely, the shepherd's body stiffened. His ears rose, every muscle locked. Caleb followed his gaze. Room 318. The door stood closed at the end of the hall, nothing unusual, yet Atlas stared at it as though he could see through the walls. A low growl emerged. Deep, dangerous, not fear, warning. The Marine slowly approached. His heartbeat quickened. Instinct told him something waited beyond that door, something important, something ugly. The closer they got, the stronger Atlas's reaction became. The dog moved ahead, sniffing, investigating, then stopped directly outside room 318. Caleb looked around. The hallway remained empty, silent, still. He reached for the handle, slowly, carefully. The door wasn't locked, that surprised him. Very slowly he pushed it open. Darkness greeted him. The room appeared empty, unused, abandoned. Dust covered parts of the furniture, no resident, no equipment, nothing. For a moment confusion replaced suspicion. Then Atlas entered. The shepherd moved directly toward the closet. No hesitation, no uncertainty, straight there. His growl deepened. Caleb crossed the room, opened the closet door, and immediately froze. Inside sat dozens of cardboard boxes, medical files, folders, records, hundreds of them. Far too many. The room wasn't a patient room anymore. It was storage, hidden storage. The Marine pulled out the nearest folder, opened it. His expression darkened instantly. Patient records, medication reports, behavioral assessments, transfer requests, nothing unusual until he looked closer. Then he saw it. Names crossed out. Dates altered, signatures that didn't match, entire pages replaced. The second folder looked worse, the third worse still. Atlas remained beside him, watching, waiting. The shepherd had found something, something important. And as Caleb flipped through file after file, one horrifying realization became impossible to ignore. Someone inside Willow Creek wasn't just hurting residents. Someone was rewriting their histories, and buried somewhere inside those boxes was the reason why. Caleb lowered himself into the chair beside the dusty desk. The room felt colder now, not physically, emotionally. The kind of cold that appeared when a terrible possibility started becoming reality. Atlas remained near the closet. The German shepherd wasn't interested in the desk, or the furniture, or anything else. His attention remained fixed on the records, almost as if he understood they mattered. Caleb pulled another folder from the box, then another, then another. Each one revealed the same pattern, small changes, tiny alterations, easy to miss individually, impossible to ignore together, medication logs adjusted, behavior reports rewritten, family contact records modified, transfer requests approved without proper signatures. Some files contained entire pages that looked newer than the surrounding documents. Replacement pages, fabricated pages. Someone had spent a lot of time covering tracks, a lot of time, and a lot of effort. The Marine continued reading. Then a familiar name stopped him cold. Grace Bennett. His pulse quickened. He opened the folder immediately. The official report described Grace as increasingly confused, combative, prone to emotional instability. The report recommended restricted visitation and additional medication. Caleb frowned. Nothing about that matched the woman he'd spoken with downstairs. Grace had been sharp, observant, intelligent. More aware than most people half her age. The report was nonsense, obvious nonsense. His eyes moved farther down the page. Another notation, patient displays paranoid behavior regarding staff. A second notation followed, reports of mistreatment determined to be hallucinations. The Marine stared at the page, then laughed quietly. Not because anything was funny, because the lie was so obvious. Grace wasn't hallucinating, she was reporting something, and someone had deliberately destroyed her credibility. The realization made his stomach turn. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. Instantly, every muscle tightened. The dog looked toward the hallway, listening. Caleb heard it a second later, footsteps coming closer. Fast, he immediately returned the folder, closed the box, moved away from the closet. The room door opened seconds later. A maintenance worker stepped inside. The man stopped abruptly when he saw Caleb. Surprise flashed across his face, then concern. Then something else, fear. "What are you doing up here?" The question came too quickly, too sharply. Caleb smiled casually. "Got lost." The maintenance worker didn't believe him, not for a second. His eyes moved around the room, then toward the closet, then toward Atlas. The German shepherd stared directly at him. Unblinking, the man swallowed. "This floor isn't for visitors." Caleb stood. "Then somebody should put up a sign." The worker forced a laugh, a bad one, nervous, artificial. His eyes kept returning to the closet. That alone told Caleb everything he needed. The files mattered. A lot. The Marine nodded politely, then walked toward the door. Atlas followed. The maintenance worker stepped aside immediately, as if he couldn't wait for them to leave. Interesting, very interesting. The moment they entered the hallway, the worker hurried inside and closed the door. Hard. Caleb didn't stop walking, but internally every alarm bell was ringing. Room 318 wasn't random storage. It was hidden storage, and people were protecting it. Back downstairs, visiting hours were ending. Families gathered coats. Residents returned to rooms. Staff members moved with increased urgency. The building was transitioning into nighttime operations, and for the first time since arriving, Caleb wished he could stay, because something told him the real Willow Creek emerged after visitors left. The public version disappeared. The private version took over. The version residents feared, the version Grace hinted at, the version Thomas clearly knew about. Atlas led the way back toward room 214. The dog suddenly stopped again, his nose lifted, sniffing, investigating. Then he turned sharply down another hallway, not toward Thomas's room, away from it. Caleb frowned. Atlas. The shepherd ignored him. A rare occurrence, very rare. The dog moved faster, purposefully, focused on something. Caleb followed. The hallway narrowed. The lighting grew dimmer. Eventually, they reached a set of double doors. A small sign hung beside them. Special Care Unit authorized personnel only. Interesting. Atlas stopped directly outside the doors, then growled, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. A warning. The Marine looked through the small window. The unit appeared darker than the rest of the facility. Several rooms lined the corridor beyond. Most doors remained closed. The atmosphere felt different, more restrictive, more isolated. Then movement caught his eye. An elderly woman stood inside one room, looking out through a narrow glass panel. The second she noticed Caleb, her eyes widened. Hope appeared instantly, then fear, then desperation. The woman rushed toward the window, pressed one hand against the glass, and mouthed something, 3 words, slowly, clearly, so there could be no mistake. "Help us, please." Caleb's heart slammed against his ribs. The woman immediately stepped back, not by choice. A staff member appeared behind her, grabbing her arm, pulling her away from the door. The woman vanished from sight. Gone just like that. The staff member looked up, saw Caleb watching, and immediately closed the room blinds. The window disappeared behind white fabric. Silence returned. The Marine stood frozen. Atlas growled again, longer this time, the kind of growl that started deep in the chest. The kind that meant danger, not suspicion, danger. Something horrible was happening inside the Special Care Unit, something bad enough that residents begged strangers for help. And suddenly Caleb understood why Thomas looked afraid, why Grace passed secret notes, why records were altered, why residents disappeared. The pieces were starting to connect, and the picture forming underneath them was ugly, very ugly. Thomas was waiting when Caleb returned. The old mechanic looked relieved, then concerned, then angry, all within a few seconds. "Where were you?" Caleb closed the door. Atlas immediately settled beside the wheelchair. Guard position. The old shepherd wasn't relaxing anymore. Not here, not in Willow Creek. The Marine pulled up a chair, then lowered his voice. "I found room 318. Every bit of color drained from Thomas's face. The reaction confirmed everything. His father knew exactly what that meant. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then the old mechanic whispered, "You shouldn't have gone there." The words carried genuine fear, not concern. Fear. "Dad." Thomas shook his head. "No, Dad." The old mechanic closed his eyes. His hands trembled slightly. Then he whispered something Caleb never expected to hear. "They took Harold." Silence. "Who?" Thomas swallowed. "The man you saw." A pause. "The one with marks on his wrists." Another pause. "They took him 3 weeks ago." The room suddenly felt airless. "What do you mean took him?" Thomas stared at the floor. "One day he was here." A pause. "The next day he wasn't." Caleb waited. The old mechanic continued. "Staff said he transferred." Another pause. "No goodbye." Another. "No family visit." His voice weakened. "No records." The Marine leaned forward. "And you didn't believe them." Thomas laughed bitterly. "No one believed them." The old mechanic looked toward the hallway, toward the door, toward the place he clearly feared. Then he whispered, "Because Harold told us he wasn't leaving." Silence. Absolute silence. Atlas lifted his head. The dog sensed the tension, the fear, the truth. Thomas's voice dropped even lower. 3 days before he disappeared, a pause. He said he found something. Another pause. He said he had proof. Caleb felt a chill crawl down his spine. What kind of proof? The old mechanic looked directly into his son's eyes, and for the first time all day there was no hesitation, no avoidance, no fear of speaking, only certainty. Proof that people here are being hurt. The room went completely silent. Outside, snow continued falling across Pine Hollow. Families drove home. Lights glowed warmly throughout town. Life continued, normal, peaceful, safe. But inside Willow Creek Recovery Home, Caleb Ward finally understood the truth. This wasn't negligence, it wasn't incompetence, it wasn't isolated abuse. Something organized was happening, something deliberate, and somewhere inside that building was the evidence. The same evidence Harold found before he vanished. The same evidence Grace was risking everything to expose. The same evidence someone inside Willow Creek was willing to hide at any cost. And Caleb had just become the next person looking for it. Caleb left Willow Creek after visiting hours ended. But his mind never left. The drive back to his motel felt longer than usual. Snow continued falling across the mountain roads. Headlights cut through darkness. Atlas occupied the passenger seat in complete silence. Normally, the old shepherd slept during drives. Not tonight. Tonight his ears remained alert. His eyes remained open, watching, listening, working, the same way he had overseas whenever something felt wrong. Caleb understood the feeling because he felt it too. The evidence he'd found wasn't enough. Not yet. Suspicion wasn't proof. Instinct wasn't proof. A frightened resident mouthing words through glass wasn't proof. But together, they formed a pattern, and patterns mattered, a lot. By the time he reached the motel, one thing had become clear. He wasn't leaving Pine Hollow, not until he understood what was happening inside Willow Creek. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee, nothing fancy, just a place to sleep. Atlas immediately moved toward the window, watching the parking lot below. Caleb sat at the small desk. Then emptied his pockets. Phone, wallet, keys, the folded note from Grace. He stared at it for several moments. Check room 318, simple words, 3 words that had changed everything. The Marine opened his laptop, then began writing names, dates, observations, questions, the same method he'd used during intelligence briefings. Organize information. Find connections. Build a picture. He wrote, Grace Bennett, intelligent, not confused, afraid, past secret note claims things happen when families aren't watching. Thomas Ward bruises, fearful, mentioned disappearances, warned me to be careful. Harold, wrist injuries, claimed to have proof, disappeared. Special care unit, restricted access. Residents appear frightened. Woman requested help. Room 318, hidden records, altered documents, false assessments, protected by staff. Then he wrote one final name. Elaine Mercer, and under it, controls information, cold behavior behind closed doors, mentioned matching records. Once Grace moved, Caleb leaned back. Thinking. The picture wasn't complete. But it was getting clearer, and the clearer it became, the uglier it looked. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Atlas immediately stood, silent, alert. The Marine checked the time, almost 10. Nobody should be visiting. He moved toward the door carefully, opened it, and froze. Deputy Ryan Mitchell stood outside. Tall, early 30s, broad shoulders, former Army. Caleb recognized him instantly. They'd met years earlier at a veterans fundraiser. The deputy looked surprised, then suspicious. Caleb Ward? The Marine nodded. Ryan Mitchell. The deputy laughed softly. Small world. Neither man smiled for long. Because Ryan clearly wasn't there socially, his expression quickly became serious. I heard you were asking questions at Willow Creek. Interesting, very interesting. Caleb opened the door wider. Come in. 5 minutes later, both men sat across from each other. Atlas remained between them, watching. The deputy looked uncomfortable, not afraid of the dog, concerned about the conversation. People talk. Ryan rubbed one hand across his jaw, especially in Pine Hollow. Caleb nodded. I've noticed. Silence. Then Ryan lowered his voice. Be careful. The exact same warning Thomas had given. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Why? The deputy hesitated. That alone was revealing. Finally, he sighed. 3 complaints. What? Over the last 2 years, a pause. 3 separate complaints involving Willow Creek. Caleb leaned forward. The deputy continued. Missing property, a pause, medication issues. Another. Physical mistreatment. Silence, and Ryan laughed bitterly, and every complaint disappeared. The room felt smaller. What do you mean disappeared? The deputy's expression darkened. Witnesses changed stories. Another pause. Families withdrew reports. Another. Residents suddenly transferred. Caleb stared. The pattern sounded familiar. Too familiar. Ryan looked toward Atlas, then back at Caleb. I tried pushing. A pause. Nothing stuck. Another. The administrator always had paperwork. His voice carried frustration. Always had explanations. The Marine nodded slowly because that matched exactly what he'd seen: records, paper trails, controlled narratives. Everything documented, everything manipulated. Ryan leaned back. Off the record? Caleb waited. The deputy's voice dropped. I think something's wrong there. Silence, but I can't prove it. The words lingered, heavy, honest. The same problem Caleb faced: instinct without evidence, suspicion without proof. Ryan stood a few minutes later, moving toward the door, then paused. If you're going to keep digging. A pause. Don't do it alone. The Marine nodded. The deputy left. The door closed. The room became quiet again. But now Caleb knew something important. He wasn't imagining things. Others had seen it too. Others had suspected. Others had tried. And somehow Willow Creek survived every accusation, every investigation, every complaint. That meant someone was very good at covering tracks, or someone powerful was helping. Neither possibility made him feel better. The next morning, Atlas woke Caleb before sunrise. The German shepherd stood beside the bed, staring, waiting. The old shepherd had always done that. No barking, no whining, just staring until Caleb surrendered. The Marine groaned. You're annoying. Atlas remained unbothered. 5 minutes later, they were outside. Cold air filled the parking lot. Snow crunched beneath their feet. The town remained quiet, still sleeping. Caleb sipped coffee while Atlas explored nearby snowbanks. Then something unexpected happened. His phone rang, unknown number. He almost ignored it, then answered. Caleb Ward. Silence, static, then a woman's voice, very soft, very frightened. Grace told me to call. The Marine stopped walking, immediately. Who is this? A pause, then, my name is Sarah. Another pause, I work at Willow Creek. Every instinct sharpened. Atlas noticed. The shepherd immediately returned, standing beside him, listening. Sarah lowered her voice further. As soon as Elaine finds out I'm talking to you. Silence! I'll lose my job. Caleb waited, patient, careful. The woman sounded terrified. Then she said something that changed everything. Harold didn't transfer. The Marine froze. Snow drifted through the early morning darkness. Cars passed somewhere in the distance. The world continued moving, yet suddenly everything felt still. What happened to him? Sarah hesitated, then whispered, I don't know. A pause, but I know they lied. Another, and if you want proof, silence, the longest silence yet. Then look at the basement records. Caleb's pulse quickened. What basement records? The answer came immediately, like she'd rehearsed it, like she'd been waiting for someone to ask. The files in room 318 are fake. A pause. The real records are downstairs. Another pause. In the basement archive. The line went silent. Then Sarah spoke one final time, a warning, a desperate warning. Whatever you do. Her voice trembled. Don't let Elaine know you're looking. The call ended just like that. Caleb stared at the phone. Then toward the sunrise beginning to brighten the horizon. Atlas sat beside him, watching, waiting. The Marine slowly slid the phone back into his pocket, the fake files upstairs, the real files downstairs, a hidden archive, a frightened employee, a missing resident. And an administrator who seemed willing to do anything to protect whatever secret Willow Creek was hiding. For the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow, Caleb felt the investigation shift. Because now he wasn't chasing suspicions. He was chasing evidence. And somewhere beneath Willow Creek Recovery Home, hidden inside a basement archive nobody was supposed to see, the truth was waiting. Caleb arrived at Willow Creek earlier than usual, much earlier. The sun had barely risen above the mountains. A pale orange glow stretched across Pine Hollow while fresh snow covered the roads. The parking lot remained nearly empty. Only a handful of staff vehicles occupied the front row. Good. Less traffic meant fewer distractions. Fewer distractions meant more opportunities to observe. Atlas stepped from the truck and immediately scanned the property. The German shepherd moved differently here, not like a pet, not like a retired working dog, like a Marine entering hostile territory. The realization bothered Caleb because Atlas had never been wrong before, not once. Inside, the lobby looked almost identical to the previous day. The same decorations, the same music, the same smiling photographs, yet now Caleb saw everything differently. The building wasn't a recovery center anymore. It was a puzzle. Every hallway contained questions. Every employee might know something. Every resident seemed to be carrying a piece of the truth. The receptionist wasn't Elaine this morning. A younger woman sat behind the desk. She smiled politely, checked him in. Barely looked up. Perfect. Less attention, exactly what he wanted. Atlas suddenly stopped walking. The shepherd's ears rose. His gaze fixed on a hallway leading toward the administrative offices. Then he looked back at Caleb. The dog didn't move, didn't bark, didn't growl, just stared. The message was obvious, something, that direction, interesting, very interesting. Caleb pretended not to notice. Instead, he headed toward Thomas's room. The old mechanic sat awake beside the window. Coffee rested on a small table nearby. The moment he saw Caleb, relief appeared across his face. Then concern, then frustration. "You're back." Caleb smiled. "Good morning to you too." Thomas shook his head. "You should have gone home." There it was again, the fear, always the fear. The old mechanic wasn't worried about himself anymore. He was worried about Caleb. That fact alone spoke volumes. Atlas moved beside the wheelchair. Thomas immediately reached down to scratch behind his ears. The shepherd relaxed slightly, only slightly. The old mechanic smiled faintly. At least somebody's happy. For a few moments they talked about ordinary things, weather, physical therapy, the farm, anything except Willow Creek, anything except the growing darkness surrounding them. Eventually Thomas lowered his voice. "Did you find anything?" The question surprised Caleb, because it was the first time his father had voluntarily asked. Progress, slow progress, but progress. The Marine sat down, then carefully told him about Grace, room 318, the altered records, the woman in the special care unit, the anonymous phone call. Thomas listened silently. The old mechanic's expression grew darker with every detail. Then Caleb mentioned Harold. The reaction was immediate. Thomas looked away. Pain crossed his face. Guilt too. Interesting, very interesting. "What?" The old mechanic rubbed one hand across his forehead. "We should have said something." Silence. "We all should have." Caleb waited. Thomas continued staring toward the window. Snow drifted beyond the glass, peaceful, beautiful, completely disconnected from the reality inside Willow Creek. "We kept telling ourselves there'd be an explanation." A pause. Then Harold disappeared. Another pause, and everyone got scared. The Marine understood. Fear was contagious, especially among vulnerable people, especially among people who believed nobody would listen. Thomas looked directly at him. "You're the first person who didn't stop asking questions." The words landed heavily because suddenly Caleb understood something important. The residents weren't just victims, they were witnesses. Witnesses who'd spent months, maybe years, being taught that speaking up accomplished nothing. Around 10 o'clock, Caleb left Thomas's room. This time he had a destination, the basement. Finding it proved surprisingly easy. Accessing it would be harder. The elevator only traveled to the first, second, and third floors. No basement button existed. Interesting. A facility this size definitely had storage below ground, meaning the basement wasn't intended for visitors, exactly what Sarah implied. Caleb spent the next hour observing, watching staff movement, learning routines, mapping hallways, the same process he'd used countless times during military operations. Eventually he found it, a heavy metal door near the laundry area, marked, "Authorized personnel only." No surprise there. The real surprise was Atlas. The moment they approached the door, the German shepherd stopped, then growled, deep, low, dangerous. The exact same reaction he'd shown outside room 318. Caleb's pulse quickened. The dog knew, maybe not details, maybe not evidence, but something beyond that door mattered, a lot. Footsteps echoed nearby. Caleb immediately moved away. A pair of staff members emerged carrying laundry carts. Both looked exhausted, overworked, distracted. Neither noticed him. The basement door opened briefly as they passed through. Only a second, yet it was enough. Caleb caught a glimpse of stairs descending below ground. Then the door closed again, locked. The Marine filed the information away. Later, he'd need another opportunity, a better one. Lunch brought another unexpected development. Grace found him, not the other way around. The former school principal approached slowly in the dining area. Atlas noticed her first. The shepherd immediately stood, tail moving gently. The old woman smiled. "You always know the good ones." Atlas accepted the compliment. Grace sat across from Caleb. No greeting, no small talk, straight to business, smart woman. "Did you find it?" The question came quietly. Caleb nodded once. "Room 318. Grace's shoulders relaxed slightly, only slightly. The old woman glanced around the room, making sure nobody listened. Then she leaned forward. What did you see? Altered records. Grace closed her eyes, pain crossed her face, then anger, a deep old anger, the kind built over time, the kind built through helplessness. They changed mine first. The statement surprised him. Grace nodded. They started with small things, a pause, medication notes. Another, behavior reports. Another, family communication. The old woman laughed bitterly. Then one day I became confused. Silence, at least according to the paperwork. Caleb stared. The woman sitting before him looked sharper than half the people he'd met recently. Grace noticed his expression. A faint smile appeared. Exactly. The smile vanished. They destroy credibility. A pause. Once they do that, nobody believes you. The words struck hard because they explained everything. Harold, Grace, the complaints, the disappearances, the altered records weren't random. They were weapons. Used to discredit anyone who caused problems, anyone who noticed too much, anyone who spoke too loudly. Grace's hands trembled slightly, not from age, from emotion. Harold found financial records. Caleb froze. What? The old woman nodded, fear returning immediately. He wasn't supposed to. A pause. He worked in accounting before retirement. Another. He noticed numbers didn't match. The room seemed to shrink, financial records, money, now things made sense. Abuse covered up for profit, the oldest story in the world. Grace lowered her voice further. So they made him unstable. Silence. Then they made him disappear. Atlas lifted his head. The shepherd sensed the change in her, the fear, the grief, the truth. Grace looked toward the hallway, then back at Caleb. For the first time since meeting her, tears filled her eyes. Please. A pause. Don't let them do it to someone else. The dining room remained busy around them, residents eating lunch, staff carrying trays, televisions playing quietly, life continuing, normal, ordinary, yet sitting across from Grace Bennett, Caleb finally realized the scale of what he was dealing with. This wasn't one bad employee, it wasn't one cruel nurse, it wasn't one isolated mistake. This was a system, a carefully built system designed to silence vulnerable people, and somewhere inside that system sat Elaine Mercer, protecting it, controlling it, profiting from it. The Marine looked toward the administrative wing. Toward the smiling woman everyone trusted, then back at Grace. And for the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow, he made a silent promise, whatever was hiding beneath Willow Creek Recovery Home. He was going to expose it, no matter who got angry. No matter who tried stopping him, no matter how deep the truth went. That promise stayed with Caleb for the rest of the afternoon. The more he observed Willow Creek, the more impossible it became to ignore the pattern. Residents who seemed afraid to speak. Staff who constantly watched certain hallways, paperwork that didn't match reality, and now financial records, money. Money always left traces, people lied, documents lied, stories changed. Money rarely did. Somewhere inside Willow Creek, someone was making decisions that hurt vulnerable people. And according to Grace, Harold had discovered how. The question wasn't whether corruption existed anymore. The question was how far it reached. At 2 o'clock, Caleb found himself sitting beside Thomas again. The old mechanic looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally. Years seemed to rest on his shoulders. Atlas lay at his feet, one ear raised, half asleep. Half listening, the way military dogs often did. Caleb closed the door before speaking. His father immediately noticed. What happened? The Marine sat down. Harold found financial records. The reaction was instant. Thomas looked away, almost guilty, almost ashamed. Grace told you. Caleb nodded. The old mechanic stared toward the floor. For several moments neither spoke. Finally Thomas sighed, a long, tired sigh, the kind people carried when they'd spent too much time regretting something. We all knew Harold was onto something. Silence. He kept talking about billing. A pause. Insurance. Another, government reimbursements. The Marine listened carefully. Thomas rubbed one trembling hand against the armrest. He said residents were being classified incorrectly. Interesting, very interesting. What does that mean? The old mechanic frowned, thinking, trying to remember. More medication. A pause, more supervision. Another. Higher payments? Caleb's pulse quickened. Fraud, not just abuse. Fraud, the pieces suddenly connected. If residents appeared more impaired on paper than they actually were, the facility could justify additional funding. Additional treatments, additional reimbursements, additional money. His jaw tightened. Thomas noticed. The old mechanic nodded slowly. That's what Harold thought. A pause. Then he disappeared. Silence filled the room, the kind of silence that said enough without words. Atlas lifted his head. The shepherd stared toward the hallway, alert, focused, listening. Then he stood immediately. Caleb followed his gaze, footsteps, several people moving quickly. The voices arrived seconds later. One belonged to Elaine. The administrator sounded angry, very angry, not the controlled professional anger she usually displayed, real anger. The kind people revealed when they thought nobody important was watching. The footsteps passed the room, continued down the corridor. Atlas remained standing, watching, waiting. Then he growled, low, dangerous. Thomas looked pale. What now? The old mechanic's voice barely rose above a whisper because he knew, somehow he knew, something had changed. And so did Caleb, because people only lost control when pressure increased. Someone inside Willow Creek was feeling pressure. The question was why. The answer arrived an hour later, unexpectedly, violently, and without warning. Caleb was walking through the recreation room when shouting erupted from the far hallway. Everyone froze, residents looked up. Staff exchanged nervous glances, then came another shout. A man's voice, angry, desperate, terrified. The Marine moved instantly. Atlas beside him, the crowd parted as they reached the source. The scene stopped him cold. An elderly resident stood near the nurse's station. Thin, gray-haired, maybe 80 years old. His hands shook violently, his eyes filled with tears. And clutched in one trembling hand was a folder. Two orderlies stood nearby, trying to calm him, trying to control him. The resident wasn't cooperating. They lied. The words echoed through the hallway. Everyone heard, residents, visitors, staff, everyone. They stole from her. The old man waved the folder. Papers scattered across the floor. The orderlies moved closer. The resident backed away, panic visible in every movement. Elaine appeared seconds later. Her expression immediately shifted into professional concern. Perfect, practiced, false. Mr. Walker. Her voice sounded soothing, gentle. The way people spoke to frightened children. Let's calm down. The resident pointed directly at her. No, silence, absolute silence. The hallway became completely still. The old man's hand trembled, but his voice didn't. They took her money. A pause. They took all of it. Every eye in the hallway turned toward Elaine. The administrator's smile vanished for half a second, then returned. You're confused. The words landed immediately. Caleb recognized the tactic, so did Grace. The former principal stood near the recreation room doorway, watching, understanding. Mr. Walker shook his head violently. No. A tear rolled down his face. I saw the papers. Another. I know what happened. The orderlies moved again, faster now, more aggressively. Atlas stepped forward, instantly. The German shepherd positioned himself between the resident and the approaching staff. The hallway froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Atlas didn't bark, didn't lunge, didn't threat. He simply stood there, a wall of muscle and certainty. The orderlies stopped immediately, because every instinct they possessed told them not to test a military K9. Elaine's expression hardened just briefly, but Caleb saw it. So did Grace. So did several residents. For the first time, the administrator looked worried. Real worry, not performance, not theater. Worry. Mr. Walker pointed toward the folder. Papers lay scattered everywhere. Some had slid beneath chairs, others covered the floor. One page caught Caleb's eye. A financial statement, a withdrawal authorization, a signature. The Marine stepped forward, picked it up, and immediately understood why everyone looked nervous. The signature didn't match, not even close. His stomach tightened. Forgery. The document practically screamed it. Mr. Walker pointed at the paper. There. His voice cracked. There. Elaine moved quickly, too quickly. Those documents are private. The administrator reached for them. Caleb didn't move. The hallway became silent again. The tension felt almost physical, heavy, sharp, dangerous. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then a new voice entered the conversation. Maybe law enforcement should look at them. Everyone turned. Deputy Ryan Mitchell stood at the end of the corridor, watching, expression unreadable. The silence that followed felt enormous, because suddenly the balance shifted, completely. Elaine knew it too. The administrator's smile finally disappeared, and for the first time since entering Willow Creek Recovery Home. Caleb watched genuine fear appear in her eyes. Deputy Ryan Mitchell didn't rush forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make dramatic accusations. He simply stood there, watching. And somehow that made the moment even more uncomfortable, because people feared calm authority far more than loud authority. The hallway remained silent. Residents stared from wheelchairs. Visitors paused mid-conversation. Staff members suddenly found the floor fascinating. Nobody wanted to be the first person to speak. Elaine recovered first. Of course she did. The administrator had spent years controlling situations, years controlling narratives, years controlling people. A single deputy wasn't enough to break those habits. Her smile returned, smaller this time, less convincing. Deputy Mitchell. Ryan nodded politely. Elaine. The greeting sounded friendly, the atmosphere wasn't, not even close. Elaine gestured toward Mr. Walker. The elderly resident still clutched several papers. His hands trembled. But he hadn't backed down, not yet. Arthur is having one of his episodes. The phrase immediately caught Caleb's attention. Episodes, interesting word, the same type of language used in Grace's file, the same language used to discredit residents. Ryan seemed to notice too. His expression didn't change. Maybe. A pause, maybe not. The administrator's smile weakened. The deputy stepped forward, slowly, calmly, then looked directly at Arthur Walker. Would you like to tell me what's going on? The old man stared at him, almost as if he couldn't believe someone was actually asking, actually listening. For several seconds, Arthur simply blinked. Then tears filled his eyes, not because he was frightened, because he was relieved somebody finally cared. They stole from Martha. The words came out broken, emotional, raw. Ryan nodded. Who's Martha? Arthur pointed toward a framed photograph sitting on a nearby table, an elderly woman smiling beside a garden. Fresh flowers surrounded the frame, memorial flowers. The realization hit Caleb instantly. Martha was dead, Arthur's wife. The deputy noticed too. Arthur's voice trembled. After she died. A pause. They emptied her account. Another. They said paperwork was signed. The old man shook his head violently. No. His eyes filled with tears. No. Elaine stepped forward. Deputy, this is inappropriate. Ryan didn't even look at her. Interesting, very interesting. The administrator wasn't used to being ignored. Arthur pointed toward the papers. My wife couldn't sign those. A pause. She'd already had the stroke. Another. Her hand barely worked. Silence spread across the hallway. The old man lowered his head, then whispered the words that changed everything. I know her signature. Nobody spoke because nobody could. The pain behind those words felt too real, too personal. Ryan carefully accepted the papers from Arthur, then began reading. One page, then another, then another. The deputy's expression slowly darkened, not dramatically, just enough for Caleb to notice. Enough for Elaine to notice, and judging by the sudden tension in her posture. She definitely noticed. Arthur looked exhausted now, like years of frustration had finally poured out all at once. Grace appeared beside him, quietly, without attracting attention. The former principal rested one hand on his shoulder. Arthur immediately relaxed slightly. The gesture clearly wasn't new. They'd supported each other before, many times, which meant something important. The residents weren't isolated, not completely. They were talking, sharing information, connecting dots, and that made them dangerous. At least dangerous to people like Elaine. The deputy finally lowered the paperwork, then looked toward the administrator. Do you have copies of these? Elaine answered instantly. Of course. Too instantly. The response sounded rehearsed, prepared. Ryan nodded slowly. I'd like to review them. Silence. The administrator's jaw tightened, only slightly. Then the smile returned, again always the smile. Naturally. The deputy slipped the documents into an evidence envelope. The movement seemed simple, routine, yet Caleb noticed something fascinating. Several staff members exchanged nervous looks, tiny looks, quick looks, but they happened. Fear. Not concern, fear, and fear meant vulnerability. Someone knew those papers mattered, a lot. The situation eventually dispersed. Residents returned to activities, visitors resumed conversations, staff members pretended everything was normal. But the illusion felt weaker now. Cracks had appeared, visible cracks. And once people noticed cracks, they started looking closer. Caleb watched the aftermath carefully. Arthur Walker wasn't escorted away, wasn't medicated, wasn't punished. Interesting. Perhaps because Ryan remained present, perhaps because too many witnesses had seen what happened. Either way, the usual system seemed disrupted. Good, very good. Atlas remained beside Arthur for nearly 20 minutes afterward. The old German shepherd sat quietly next to the elderly widower, not moving, not demanding attention, just staying close. Arthur occasionally rested one trembling hand on the dog's head. The sight affected everyone who saw it, even staff. Because no matter how much deception existed inside Willow Creek, moments like that remained real. Late that afternoon, Caleb finally got another surprise. Grace approached him again. This time she looked more nervous than before, much more nervous. The former principal kept checking over her shoulder, watching hallways. Watching staff, watching doors. Atlas immediately stood when she approached. His tail moved gently. Grace smiled faintly. Smart dog. The shepherd accepted the compliment, then resumed scanning the room, working, always working. Grace lowered herself into a chair, then leaned closer. Arthur wasn't supposed to find those papers. Caleb frowned. What papers? The old woman's eyes moved toward the nurse's station, making sure nobody listened. Then she answered, the estate records. Silence. He found them accidentally. Another pause. 3 months ago. Interesting, very interesting. Grace folded her hands tightly together. Residents die. The statement sounded obvious, but her expression suggested otherwise. They take over accounts. A pause. Assets. Another. Insurance settlements. Caleb's stomach tightened. The old woman nodded. You understand now. He did, unfortunately, too well. The scam wasn't limited to abuse. It wasn't limited to false records. This was financial exploitation, systematic exploitation. The elderly residents weren't just patients. They were targets. Grace looked exhausted suddenly, as if speaking the truth required physical effort. Harold figured it out first. There it was again, Harold. Everything seemed to lead back to Harold. What exactly did he find? The old woman swallowed. Fear flickered across her face, then determination replaced it. He found duplicate accounts. A pause. Residents charged twice. Another. Insurance billed for services never provided. The pieces continued fitting together, like a puzzle finally revealing its picture. Grace looked directly into Caleb's eyes, and what she said next made his blood run cold. Some residents are worth more money heavily medicated. Silence. Absolute silence. The implication hit immediately. The altered records, the medication logs, the false diagnoses, everything. Every single piece suddenly made sense. Grace nodded slowly, as if reading his thoughts. They make people look worse on paper. A pause. Then they get paid more. The Marine sat back, trying to process the scale, trying to process the cruelty. These weren't mistakes. They weren't shortcuts. They were business decisions. Decisions made at the expense of vulnerable people. Grace's hands trembled. Then she reached into her sweater pocket, carefully, slowly, and removed something folded several times, a piece of paper, old, worn, protected. She placed it in front of Caleb. I've been hiding this. The words barely rose above a whisper. Caleb unfolded it carefully, then froze. A ledger, handwritten, names, dates, amounts, transfers, dozens of entries. The numbers alone were staggering. And at the very bottom sat a name he'd never seen before, not Elaine, not Willow Creek, someone else, someone above them. Someone connected, Crestview Senior Holdings. The name meant nothing to Caleb, yet the reaction in Grace's face told him it should. The old woman leaned closer, then whispered the most dangerous words she'd spoken yet. Elaine doesn't run this. Silence. She works for them. The room suddenly felt much smaller, because if Grace was right, then Willow Creek wasn't the problem. It was only one piece of something much bigger. And somewhere beyond Pine Hollow, beyond the smiling administrator, beyond the hidden records and frightened residents. Someone else was making money from all of it. Caleb stared at the name for several seconds. Crestview Senior Holdings. The words meant nothing, yet somehow they changed everything. Because corruption was one thing. A single administrator abusing authority inside a small-town recovery center was horrible enough. But corporations, investment groups, companies operating from a distance, that was different. That was organized, deliberate, professional. Grace watched him carefully. The old woman seemed exhausted, like every sentence cost her energy, like every truth carried risk. How long have you had this? Caleb held up the ledger. Grace glanced around the room before answering. Almost 5 months. The Marine nearly dropped it. 5 months, she nodded. I found it in a storage cart. A pause. Someone misplaced it. Another. Only for a few minutes. The old woman gave a sad smile. Long enough. Caleb looked down again. The entry stretched back years, not months. Years, transfers, billing adjustments, account movements, approval codes, numbers most people would have ignored, but someone with Harold's accounting background, someone would have noticed immediately. Grace pointed to several entries. Those don't belong. What do you mean? They don't match. Silence. The old woman tapped the page again. Money comes in. A pause, then disappears. Another, then appears somewhere else. Caleb nodded slowly. Money laundering wasn't his specialty, but hiding funds rarely looked complicated once someone found the right records. The trick was finding them. Harold apparently had, and now Harold was gone. That evening after leaving Willow Creek, Caleb sat inside the motel room with the ledger spread across the desk. Atlas rested beside the bed, watching, always watching. The Marine had spent years reviewing intelligence reports, military briefings. Operational documents, patterns, the ledger contained one. He just hadn't fully found it yet. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Atlas immediately stood. The shepherd moved toward the door, silent, alert. Caleb checked through the peephole. Deputy Ryan Mitchell, again. The Marine opened it. Ryan entered quickly. Closed the door behind him, then immediately noticed the ledger. What is that? Caleb slid it across. The deputy read for several moments. His expression darkened, then darkened further. Finally, he looked up. Where did you get this? Grace. Ryan sat down heavily. The chair creaked beneath him. This is bad. A pause, really bad. The Marine nodded. I figured. The deputy continued studying the pages, then stopped. His finger rested on a familiar name, Crestview Senior Holdings. The reaction surprised Caleb. You know them? Ryan laughed. A humorless laugh, the kind people used when they wished they didn't know something. Yeah, silence. They own 8 facilities across 3 states. Caleb stared. 8, not 1, 8. The deputy rubbed one hand across his face. They've had complaints before. A pause, nothing proven. Another. Never enough evidence. The picture kept growing, and every new detail made it worse. Ryan looked toward the ledger again, then toward Caleb, then back. This might be enough. Silence. The deputy lowered his voice. If there are supporting records. There it was, the missing piece, records. Real records, not the altered files in room 318, the basement archive. Sarah's words returned immediately. The real records are downstairs. Caleb looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at Caleb. Both men arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. The deputy nodded. The basement. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The next afternoon, Willow Creek hosted a family appreciation event, a public relations exercise. Residents gathered in common areas, families visited, staff smiled constantly. Food appeared, music played, everything looked wonderful, exactly the type of event designed to reassure outsiders, exactly the type of event that created distractions. Caleb arrived with Atlas shortly after noon. The lobby bustled with activity. People moved everywhere. Visitors, residents, volunteers, employees, chaos, controlled chaos, perfect cover. Thomas immediately noticed something in his son's expression. The old mechanic lowered his voice. You're planning something. Caleb smiled faintly. His father knew him too well. Thomas sighed. I hate when you get that look. What look? The Marine look. Atlas stretched out beside the wheelchair. The old mechanic scratched behind one ear, then looked toward his son. The humor disappeared. You find what you need. A pause, then leave. Interesting, not be careful, not don't do it. Find what you need, then leave. Progress. Thomas finally believed someone might actually expose the truth. At exactly 1:37 p.m., Caleb slipped away. The timing wasn't random. He'd been watching patterns, studying movements, learning routines. The laundry corridor remained empty during lunch service. For approximately 7 minutes, today would have to be enough. Atlas followed. The shepherd moved quietly, almost silently. The restricted hallway appeared empty. No staff, no visitors, no witnesses. The heavy basement door stood closed, waiting. Caleb crossed the corridor. Grabbed the handle, turned, unlocked. Someone had forgot to secure it, or maybe someone was helping. Either way, he wasn't complaining. The door opened. Cold air drifted upward. Atlas immediately stepped ahead. The stairs descended into darkness. Concrete walls, industrial lighting, the smell of dust and old paper. The smell of secrets. Caleb moved carefully, years of habit guiding every step. The basement stretched farther than expected. Storage rooms lined the corridor, maintenance equipment, archived supplies, medical inventory. Then Atlas stopped. Again. The German shepherd turned sharply toward a steel door near the end of the hall. No sign, no label, nothing, just a plain steel door. Atlas growled, low, dangerous. The Marine approached, tried the handle, locked, of course. He looked around, nothing. Then noticed a keypad. Interesting, very interesting. Most archive rooms didn't require keypads, not in facilities like this. Whatever sat behind that door mattered. A lot. Footsteps suddenly echoed from somewhere deeper in the basement. Caleb immediately moved back into shadow, Atlas beside him, silent, waiting. A maintenance worker appeared moments later, pushing a cart. The same man Caleb had seen near room 318. The man approached the keypad, entered 6 digits. The lock clicked. Then the door opened. For several seconds, Caleb glimpsed shelves, hundreds of shelves, records, boxes, files, the real archive. Then the man disappeared inside. The door closed, locked again. Caleb smiled slightly. Now he knew. Now he had confirmation. Now he just needed access. The chance arrived unexpectedly. 10 minutes later, the maintenance worker exited carrying several boxes, balanced awkwardly in both arms. The moment he turned the corner, one box slipped. Papers exploded across the floor. The man cursed, loudly, frustrated, distracted. Atlas looked toward Caleb. The Marine understood immediately. Opportunity. They approached. Need a hand. The worker looked up. Recognition appeared, then annoyance, then relief. Yeah, the man knelt, gathering papers. Caleb helped carefully, quietly. Then he saw it, a resident file, not altered, not sanitized, the original. A photograph sat attached. Below it, Harold Jenkins. Caleb's pulse jumped. The maintenance worker hadn't noticed. Too busy collecting documents, the Marine scanned the page quickly, then froze. A notation near the bottom caught his eye. Not transferred, not discharged, not deceased. Instead it read, relocated, Crestview Regional Assessment Center. Date included. Approval code included. No family notification, no forwarding information, nothing, just gone. The worker finally grabbed the page, stuffed it back into the box, unaware of what Caleb had just seen. But the damage was done, because now they had something new, something important. Harold hadn't vanished, someone moved him. And wherever Crestview Regional Assessment Center was, the missing resident might still be alive. Caleb didn't react, not outwardly. Years of military service had taught him how to absorb information without revealing anything. Inside, however, his mind raced. Harold Jenkins was alive. Or at least he had been alive when someone moved him. The difference mattered, a lot. The maintenance worker continued gathering papers, unaware he just exposed the most important lead in the entire investigation. Atlas sat quietly nearby, watching, waiting. The German shepherd seemed to understand something significant had happened. The worker finally lifted the last box. Appreciate it. Caleb nodded. No problem. Then stepped aside. The man disappeared down the corridor. The basement fell silent again. Only the hum of old ventilation systems remained. Caleb looked toward the archive door, toward the keypad. Toward the records hidden beyond it. Now he knew two things. First, Sarah had been telling the truth. Second, Harold hadn't simply vanished. Someone moved him through an organized system, a system connected to Crestview, a system that extended far beyond Willow Creek. And suddenly the investigation became much larger than a single facility. That evening, Caleb met Ryan at a diner on the edge of town. The kind of place that served coffee strong enough to remove paint. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Atlas occupied his usual spot beside the booth. Several customers greeted him by name. The dog accepted attention with professional dignity. Ryan arrived carrying a folder. His expression looked grim, not unusual lately. The deputy slid into the booth. What happened? Caleb told him everything. The basement. The archive room, Harold's file, the relocation notation, every detail. Ryan listened carefully, then slowly leaned back. Damn, a pause. That's bigger than I expected. The Marine nodded. Same. Ryan opened the folder he'd brought. Inside sat printed records, corporate filings, ownership documents, licensing information. The deputy slid several pages across the table. Crestview. Caleb studied them. The picture became ugly immediately, very ugly. The company owned facilities in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, nursing homes, recovery centers, long-term care facilities, assessment centers, dozens of locations, millions of dollars. And a complicated corporate structure designed to hide accountability. Ryan pointed toward one name, Daniel Hargrove, CEO, founder, chairman. The man sat atop the entire organization. The deputy tapped the page. Everything leads back to him. Caleb memorized the name, Daniel Hargrove. The man making money from vulnerable elderly residents. The man hiding behind layers of paperwork in corporate offices. The man who probably never met the people suffering beneath his system. Ryan lowered his voice. You know what scares me? The Marine looked up. The deputy glanced around the diner. Making sure nobody listened, then he answered. The complaints aren't isolated. A pause. They happen everywhere. Silence. Ryan slid another report across, then another, different facilities, different states, same patterns, medication discrepancies, financial complaints, missing documentation, questionable transfers, the same story repeated over and over. The realization settled heavily between them. Willow Creek wasn't unique. It was a branch, one branch on a very large tree. The next morning, everything changed. Caleb arrived at Willow Creek expecting another day of quiet investigation. Instead, he found chaos, ambulances, police vehicles, staff gathered outside. Residents staring from windows, the atmosphere felt tense. Wrong, very wrong. Atlas immediately became alert. The shepherd moved closer, scanning, listening, working. Caleb parked and stepped out. The cold morning air carried nervous voices, concern, confusion, fear. He spotted Ryan near the entrance. The deputy looked exhausted. What happened? Ryan's expression darkened. Grace. The single word hit like a hammer. Caleb's stomach dropped. What about her? Silence. Then someone found her unconscious. Everything stopped. For a moment the world seemed to freeze. Snow drifted through the air. Cars passed in the distance. People talked nearby. Yet none of it registered. Only Ryan's words. Grace, unconscious, the former principal, the woman who passed notes, the woman who knew too much, the woman who gave him the ledger. Caleb immediately started toward the entrance. Ryan grabbed his arm. She's alive. Relief arrived, briefly, then vanished. Because Ryan's expression remained grim. Just barely. The Marine stared. What happened? The deputy looked toward the building, then back. No one knows. A pause. Officially, there it was, officially, the word nobody trusted anymore. Ryan rubbed one hand across his face. They say she fell. Neither man believed that. Not for a second. Not after everything they'd learned. Not after Harold. Not after the records. Not after the threats. The timing alone made it impossible. Grace had become a problem, and now Grace was in the hospital. The message felt obvious, dangerously obvious. Inside Willow Creek, fear spread like wildfire. Residents whispered. Staff avoided eye contact. The atmosphere felt completely different. The illusion was breaking. People sensed it. The Marine found Thomas in his room. The old mechanic already knew. Of course he knew. News traveled quickly among residents. Thomas looked shaken. Genuinely shaken. What did they do to her? The question emerged immediately. Not what happened. What did they do? The wording mattered because it revealed what everyone already believed. Caleb sat beside him. We don't know. Thomas laughed bitterly, a humorless sound. Sure we do. Silence filled the room. The old mechanic stared toward the hallway, then lowered his voice. People are scared. A pause, really scared. Another. They think they're next. The words lingered, heavy, painful, real. Atlas moved closer to Thomas's wheelchair, resting against it, protective, comforting. The old mechanic scratched behind one ear absent-mindedly, then suddenly looked toward Caleb. Determination appeared for the first time. Real determination, not fear, not caution, resolve. You need to find Harold. The statement surprised him. Thomas nodded firmly. He's alive. A pause. He knows what happened. Another. He knows everything. The Marine stared. His father continued. If you find Harold, silence. You find the truth. Later that afternoon, Sarah called again. This time she sounded terrified, more terrified than before. The moment Caleb answered, he knew something was wrong. Grace didn't fall. The words came immediately. No greeting, no hesitation, just truth, raw and urgent. The Marine stepped outside into an empty courtyard, away from listening ears. What happened? Sarah's breathing sounded uneven, like she'd been crying, like she'd been running, maybe both. Then she whispered something that changed everything. I saw the security footage. Silence, absolute silence. What footage? Sarah lowered her voice further. They erased it. A pause, but I saw it first. Caleb's pulse quickened. Snow drifted across the courtyard. The world seemed to narrow around the conversation. What did you see? The answer came slowly, carefully, as if saying it aloud made it real. Grace was arguing with Elaine. A pause in the stairwell. Another. 30 minutes later, she was unconscious. The Marine felt anger rise, cold anger, the dangerous kind, the controlled kind. Sarah continued. Her voice trembling. I think they're panicking. Interesting, very interesting, because panic created mistakes, and mistakes created evidence. What else? Silence, then they're moving records. Caleb froze. What? The archive. A pause, the basement archive. Another. They started boxing everything up this morning. The implication hit immediately, destroying evidence, or relocating it. Neither option was acceptable. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. If you're going to do something. Silence, the longest silence yet, then do it soon. The call ended. Caleb stood alone in the falling snow. Phone still in hand. Atlas beside him, watching, waiting. The investigation had reached a turning point. Grace was in the hospital, evidence was being moved, staff were panicking. And somewhere beyond Pine Hollow sat Harold Jenkins, a missing witness who might hold the key to exposing everything. The clock was running now, and for the first time since arriving at Willow Creek, Caleb realized the people responsible knew someone was coming for them, which meant the next move would decide everything. That night nobody slept well. Not Caleb, not Ryan, not Thomas. And certainly not the people inside Willow Creek. Fear had changed the atmosphere of the facility. The residents felt it. The staff felt it. Even Atlas seemed to feel it. The old shepherd spent most of the night awake beside the motel window. watching, listening, waiting. The same way he'd done before dangerous operations overseas. Caleb noticed, because Atlas only acted like that when something was coming, and something was. At 6:12 the next morning, Ryan's phone call woke him. The deputy didn't waste time. "We found Grace." Caleb sat upright instantly. "Is she okay?" A pause. "She's conscious." Relief arrived, then Ryan continued. "But you need to get to the hospital." The tone in his voice said everything. Something important had happened, very important. 20 minutes later, Caleb and Atlas entered Pine Hollow Regional Hospital. The building smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. Nurses moved through the hallways, doctors reviewed charts, normal life. Yet room 307 felt anything but normal. A deputy stood outside. Ryan waited nearby. The moment he saw Caleb, he nodded toward the door. "She wants to talk." Inside, Grace Bennett looked smaller, older, fragile. Bruising darkened one side of her face. A sling supported her left arm, but her eyes remained sharp, the same eyes that noticed everything, the same eyes that refused to surrender. Atlas approached slowly. The old woman smiled the second she saw him, then reached out with her good hand. The German shepherd rested his head against her side. Gentle, careful, protective, Grace stroked his fur. For a moment she simply closed her eyes, taking comfort from the presence. Then she opened them again and looked directly at Caleb. "It wasn't an accident." The words came immediately, no hesitation, no uncertainty. The room became silent. Ryan stepped closer. "What happened?" Grace looked toward the closed door, making sure nobody else listened. Then she answered. "I confronted Elaine." A pause. "About Harold." Another. "About the money." The old woman's voice weakened slightly, but her determination didn't. Grace continued. "She told me to stop asking questions. Silence. Then she threatened me." Ryan and Caleb exchanged a glance. Threatened, that mattered a lot. Grace swallowed. "I recorded it." Nobody spoke. Because suddenly the room felt too small, too quiet, too important. Caleb leaned forward. "You what?" A faint smile appeared. The former principal looked almost proud. "I was a school principal for 30 years. A pause. "I know bullies." Another. "I know liars." The smile widened slightly. "And I know how to collect evidence." Ryan stared, then laughed softly, not because it was funny, because it was brilliant. Grace nodded. "There was a recorder." A pause. "In my room." The deputy's expression changed immediately. "Still there?" Grace looked away, then slowly shook her head. "No." Silence. "They searched my room." The hope vanished. Then she smiled again, a very different smile, a dangerous smile, the kind teachers used when students underestimated them. "I made a copy." The room went completely silent. Atlas lifted his head. Even the dog seemed interested. Grace pointed toward her bedside table. "Inside my Bible." Ryan opened the drawer carefully. Inside sat an old leather Bible, worn edges, highlighted passages, years of use. The deputy opened it and froze. A small memory card fell into his hand. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke, because everyone understood if Grace was telling the truth, everything might change. The recording took 42 minutes to retrieve, another 20 to review, and less than 30 seconds to destroy Elaine Mercer's future. The four of them sat inside a private conference room. Grace, Ryan, Caleb, and Atlas. The recording began normally. Room sounds, conversation, movement. Then came Grace's voice. Then Elaine's. The administrator sounded exactly as Caleb expected. Cold, controlled, dangerous. The conversation grew heated quickly. Grace challenged her. Questioned financial records. Questioned Harold, questioned missing residents. And then came the moment everyone needed. Elaine stopped pretending. Her voice changed. No warmth, no professionalism, no mask, only anger, only arrogance, only truth. "Nobody is going to believe you." Silence. Then they barely believed themselves. The room felt colder. Ryan stared at the speaker, expression hardening. Then came another statement, even worse. Harold should have minded his own business. Nobody spoke. The recording continued. Then another line, another admission, another mistake. "Some people don't belong here forever." Grace challenged her, asked where Harold went. Elaine refused to answer directly, but she didn't deny it either, not once. The deputy stopped the recording. Silence filled the room, absolute silence. Then Ryan slowly looked up. "That's enough." A pause, way more than enough. For the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow, they had evidence. Real evidence, not suspicions, not theories, not assumptions, evidence, and evidence changed everything. Unfortunately, so did desperation. By noon, Elaine knew. Nobody ever discovered exactly how. Perhaps someone warned her. Perhaps she noticed investigators moving differently. Perhaps she simply sensed danger. Regardless, she knew, and she ran. The alert came while Caleb sat with Thomas. Ryan called, one sentence, that's all it took. "She's gone." The Marine stood immediately. Atlas was already moving. The deputy continued. "Her office is empty." A pause, vehicle missing. Another, "We're tracking her now." The call ended. Thomas stared. "What happened?" Caleb looked toward the window, toward the mountains beyond Pine Hollow, then answered. "She's running." The old mechanic closed his eyes. For several seconds he said nothing, then finally whispered, "Good." Not because he wanted revenge, not because he hated her, because guilty people ran and innocent people didn't. The pursuit lasted 6 hours. State police joined. Highway patrol joined. Investigators joined. Every agency suddenly cared. Funny how evidence worked. The same concerns ignored for years now generated immediate action. Caleb spent most of the afternoon with Ryan, monitoring updates, following developments, watching the net tighten. Eventually, the call came. Elaine Mercer was arrested 73 miles outside Boise, driving south. 2 suitcases, cash, several hard drives, and dozens of facility records, trying to leave, trying to disappear. Trying to save herself. Too late, far too late. That evening, something remarkable happened inside Willow Creek. The atmosphere changed, not completely, not instantly, but noticeably. Residents smiled, actually smiled. Staff members whispered openly. People who'd spent months living under fear suddenly felt something unfamiliar: hope. Grace returned the following day, bruised, sore, still recovering, but smiling. Arthur Walker cried when he saw her. Several residents hugged her, others simply thanked her. The old woman accepted it all with quiet dignity, then immediately asked about Harold, because even now she hadn't forgotten. Neither had Caleb. Because the biggest question remained unanswered. Where was Harold Jenkins? And was he still alive? 3 days later, they got their answer. A federal investigator called Ryan. A Crestview facility in northern Utah had been searched, records recovered, patients identified, transfers documented, and among those records sat one familiar name. Harold Jenkins, alive, recovering, confused, but alive. The news spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Residents cried, staff cried, even Thomas smiled for the first time in weeks. Because Harold wasn't just a witness anymore, he was proof, living proof, proof that everything they'd feared had been real. Proof that they hadn't imagined it, proof that speaking up mattered. And for the first time since stepping inside Willow Creek Recovery Home, Caleb Ward began to believe they might actually win. Not just against Elaine, not just against Willow Creek, against the entire system. The system that thought elderly people were too weak to fight back. The system that thought families wouldn't ask questions. The system that underestimated a retired Marine, a stubborn school principal, a determined deputy, and one very loyal German shepherd named Atlas. The federal investigation moved faster than anyone expected, because once investigators gained access to Crestview's records, everything started unraveling. Not slowly, not carefully, rapidly. The way a rotten structure collapses once someone removes the first supporting beam. For years, complaints had existed in isolation. A resident here, a family there. An employee who quit unexpectedly. A report that disappeared. A concern that went nowhere. Separate incidents, separate stories, separate victims. Now investigators finally saw what Caleb, Grace, and Ryan had discovered. The stories weren't separate. They were connected, every one of them. 2 weeks after Elaine's arrest, federal agents arrived at Willow Creek. Not 1 or 2. Nearly a dozen: financial investigators, healthcare fraud specialists, federal auditors, people carrying boxes, laptops, evidence bags. The sight alone transformed the facility. Residents gathered near windows, watching, whispering, hoping. For the first time in years, the people who'd been ignored felt seen. Thomas watched from his wheelchair near the lobby. Atlas sat beside him. The German shepherd had become something of a celebrity inside Willow Creek. Residents greeted him every morning. Staff brought treats. Visitors stopped to pet him. Nobody minded. Atlas accepted the attention with the calm dignity of a retired soldier. A federal investigator approached Thomas that afternoon. A woman named Rebecca Monroe, sharp eyes, direct manner, the kind of person who clearly preferred facts over excuses. She spent nearly 2 hours speaking with him. Then another hour with Grace, then Arthur, then dozens of other residents. The stories kept matching. Different details, same pattern: fear, manipulation, financial exploitation, excessive medication, threats, silence. The evidence piled higher every day, and with every new statement, Crestview's position became weaker. 3 days later, Harold Jenkins finally returned. Not permanently, not yet. Investigators flew him to Idaho to provide testimony. The old accountant looked thinner than expected, older too. The months had taken their toll, but he was alive, and that mattered very much. The moment Harold entered Willow Creek, the atmosphere changed. Residents gathered throughout the lobby. Watching, waiting, many of them cried openly, because for months Harold had been a ghost story, a warning, a symbol of what happened when people asked too many questions. Now he stood right in front of them. Alive, real, proof. Grace was the first to reach him. The former principal hugged him tightly. Arthur followed, then Thomas, then others. The scene affected everyone present, including the investigators, including Caleb, including Ryan. Harold eventually sat in a chair near the fireplace. Atlas immediately approached. The German shepherd rested beside him, as if standing guard. As if protecting another witness. Harold laughed softly. His voice sounded rough, unused, tired. Good dog. Atlas accepted the compliment, then resumed watching the room. The old accountant looked toward Caleb, studied him carefully, then smiled. So you're the Marine. Caleb nodded, and you're Harold. The old man laughed. Apparently. The humor faded, then came seriousness, the kind built from painful experience. Harold looked around the lobby, at the residents, at the investigators, at the people who'd spent months living under fear. Then he quietly said something nobody forgot. I thought I was going to die before anybody believed me. Silence followed because nobody knew how to answer that. The testimony lasted nearly 6 hours. Federal agents recorded every word, every detail, every date, every document. Harold remembered everything. Names, transfers, accounts, transactions, approval codes. Years of accounting work had trained his memory, and now that memory became a weapon. The old accountant explained how Crestview manipulated billing, how residents were classified as requiring more intensive care than they actually needed, how medication levels increased reimbursement rates, how financial guardianships were quietly redirected, how deceased residents' estates were targeted, how records were altered, how complaints vanished, and finally, how residents who discovered too much were transferred, moved, isolated, silenced, not murdered, not officially, simply relocated to distant facilities where nobody knew them, where families rarely visited, where credibility could be destroyed. The system was horrifying, not because it was dramatic, because it was efficient. Cold, calculated, profitable. By the end of Harold's testimony, federal investigators looked stunned, even experienced ones, because they'd expected fraud. They hadn't expected the scale. The arrests began the following week. Not just Elaine, others, several administrators. Financial managers, regional supervisors, corporate executives, one by one, piece by piece. The network started collapsing. News crews arrived in Pine Hollow, then more, national reporters, television interviews, articles, investigations. The story spread. People across the country learned about Crestview. Families began asking questions about facilities in their own towns. Former employees came forward, former residents came forward, the floodgates opened. And once they opened, they never closed again. Through all of it, Thomas changed, not physically. The stroke still limited him. Age still weighed on him, recovery remained difficult, but emotionally, something shifted. The fear disappeared, slowly at first. Then completely. One evening, Caleb found him sitting outside beneath the setting sun. The old mechanic looked peaceful, really peaceful, for the first time since arriving at Willow Creek. Atlas rested beside him. As usual, Thomas smiled as Caleb approached. Nice evening. The Marine sat nearby. It is. Silence settled comfortably between them. Then Thomas spoke. You know, a pause. I was ashamed. Caleb looked over. The old mechanic stared toward the mountains. When all this started. Another pause. When people got hurt. Another. I didn't do anything. The confession sounded painful. Like something carried too long. Caleb listened. Thomas continued. I kept telling myself somebody else would fix it. A pause, somebody stronger. Another, somebody younger. The old mechanic laughed softly, then shook his head. Turns out that was just fear. Silence. The Marine thought about that. Then answered, you weren't the one hurting people. Thomas nodded. I know. A pause, but I should have spoken sooner. The words lingered because deep down many residents felt exactly the same. Grace, Arthur, others. People blamed themselves for surviving, blamed themselves for being afraid. Blamed themselves for not fighting harder. Yet fear wasn't failure, fear was human, and eventually they all understood that. A month later, Willow Creek looked different, completely different. New administrators arrived, independent oversight began, residents participated in decisions, families visited more frequently. Transparency became policy. Not because corporations suddenly developed conscience, because people were watching closely, very closely, and nobody wanted another scandal. Grace resumed organizing activities. Arthur started a gardening club. Thomas helped repair furniture in the workshop. Life returned. Normal life, honest life. The kind that should have existed all along. One afternoon, Caleb stood near the courtyard fence watching residents enjoy the spring sunshine. Flowers bloomed across the grounds, birds filled the trees. Laughter drifted through the air. Atlas sat beside him. The old German shepherd seemed content, comfortable, at peace. Ryan joined them, carrying coffee. The deputy handed one cup over. "Thought you'd want this." Caleb accepted it. The two men watched the courtyard quietly. Then Ryan smiled. "You know," a pause. "If that dog hadn't started growling on day one." Caleb laughed. The deputy wasn't wrong. Ryan pointed toward Atlas. "He figured it out before all of us." The shepherd looked up briefly, then returned to watching residents, uninterested in praise, exactly as expected. Ryan shook his head. "Smartest investigator in Pine Hollow." Caleb scratched behind Atlas's ears. The old dog leaned slightly into the touch. For a moment everything felt peaceful, complete, like the worst part was finally over. Neither man realized another surprise still waited. One that would bring the story full circle. One that would remind everyone exactly why this fight mattered. Because 3 days later, a letter arrived, and the name written on the envelope changed everything once again. The envelope arrived on a quiet Thursday morning. Nothing about it seemed unusual at first. White paper, standard postage, no return address, just a name written neatly across the front, Thomas Ward. The mail clerk handed it over during breakfast. The old mechanic accepted it absently, then froze. His expression changed immediately. Caleb noticed. So did Grace, so did Atlas. The German shepherd lifted his head from beneath the table, watching. Thomas stared at the handwriting. For several long seconds he didn't move, then he slowly sat down. "What is it?" Caleb asked. The old mechanic swallowed. His hands trembled slightly, not from age this time, from emotion. "I know this handwriting." The room grew quiet. Residents nearby continued talking. Coffee cups clinked. Silverware scraped plates. Normal sounds, yet suddenly everything felt distant. Thomas carefully opened the envelope. A folded letter rested inside, nothing else, no photographs, no documents, just a letter. The old mechanic unfolded it slowly, then began reading. Halfway through the first paragraph, tears appeared in his eyes, real tears. The kind Caleb had only seen a handful of times in his entire life. The Marine immediately sat beside him. "Dad." Thomas couldn't answer, not immediately. Instead, he handed over the letter. Caleb took it, looked down, and immediately understood. The signature at the bottom explained everything. Jacob Ward. Silence, absolute silence, because Jacob Ward was Thomas's younger brother, Caleb's uncle. The man nobody had seen in nearly 20 years. The man who vanished after a bitter family dispute. The man everyone assumed would never contact them again. Yet here he was in a letter, after 2 decades. The message wasn't long, just honest. Jacob explained he'd seen the news, seen Willow Creek on television, seen Thomas interviewed by reporters, and for the first time in years he'd realized how much time had passed. Too much time. The letter contained no excuses, no attempts to rewrite history. Only regret, and one final sentence. "If you'll have me, I'd like to come home." Thomas stared out the window. Snow had disappeared completely now. Spring sunlight filled the courtyard. Life moved outside. Residents laughed. Birds sang. The world felt bright. The old mechanic wiped his eyes, then laughed softly. A shaky laugh, a relieved laugh, the laugh of someone receiving something they'd stopped hoping for years ago. "Well," he cleared his throat, "that's unexpected." 2 weeks later, Jacob arrived. The reunion wasn't dramatic. There was no movie-style sprint across parking lots, no emotional speeches, no perfect resolution. Just 2 elderly brothers standing face to face for the first time in 20 years, both older, both slower, both carrying mistakes. The silence between them lasted nearly a minute. Then Jacob finally spoke. "You look terrible." Thomas laughed, actually laughed. "You're not exactly handsome yourself." That broke the tension instantly. The brothers embraced, awkwardly, emotionally, honestly, and just like that, 20 years of distance began disappearing. Not completely, not immediately, but enough to start. Grace cried, Arthur cried, several residents cried. Ryan later claimed something got stuck in his eye. Nobody believed him. Meanwhile, the Crestview investigation continued expanding. Federal agents uncovered more facilities. More victims, more fraudulent transfers, more stolen assets. The deeper they dug, the worse things became. Eventually, they reached Daniel Hargrove, the man at the top, the man whose name appeared throughout corporate records. The man who'd spent years hiding behind lawyers and executives. That protection didn't last. 3 months after Elaine's arrest, federal charges were announced. Healthcare fraud, financial exploitation, conspiracy, evidence tampering, witness intimidation. The list seemed endless. News outlets covered the story nationwide. Families from multiple states came forward. Former employees testified, former residents testified, and at the center of it all sat evidence gathered because a few people refused to stay silent. Grace, Harold, Thomas, Arthur, Ryan, Sarah, and one retired Marine who kept asking questions. Summer arrived. The mountains surrounding Pine Hollow turned green, wildflowers covered hillsides. The air smelled of pine and warm earth. For the first time in a long time, Willow Creek felt like what it was supposed to be, a place of recovery, not fear, not control. Recovery. Residents spent afternoons outside. Families visited regularly. Staff actually smiled. The transformation felt remarkable. Almost unbelievable. One afternoon, Caleb found Grace sitting beneath a large maple tree. Atlas rested beside her. The old shepherd had become famous throughout the facility. Children visiting grandparents searched for him. Residents saved treats for him. Nurses greeted him before greeting each other. Grace scratched behind his ears. The dog sighed contentedly. "You know," she smiled. "This entire place trusts him." Caleb laughed, "Probably more than management. Definitely more than management." The old woman looked across the courtyard, toward residents gardening, playing cards, talking, living, then her expression softened. "We almost lost this." The Marine followed her gaze. She wasn't talking about the building. She was talking about people, community, hope, dignity, the things that mattered. Grace smiled again. "But we didn't." Months later, the federal trial finally began. The proceedings lasted weeks. Evidence filled entire rooms. Witnesses testified for days. Financial records stretched back years, and every piece told the same story. Greed, exploitation, abuse. Not everyone involved went to prison. Some cooperated, some testified, some accepted plea deals, but the people most responsible faced consequences, real consequences, the kind that couldn't be explained away by paperwork. The kind that couldn't be hidden inside altered records. When the verdicts finally arrived, residents gathered around televisions throughout Willow Creek, watching, waiting, listening. Then the announcements came: guilty, 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 again and again and again. The room erupted, not with celebration, with relief, because justice wasn't about revenge. It was about acknowledgement, the acknowledgement that what happened was real, that victims mattered, that truth mattered, that somebody finally listened. That evening after the verdicts, Caleb sat outside with Thomas. The sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. The sky glowed orange and gold. Atlas rested between them. The old shepherd seemed older these days, a little slower, a little grayer, but still strong, still present, still Atlas. Thomas watched the sunset quietly, then finally spoke. "You know what surprises me?" Caleb looked over. "What?" The old mechanic smiled. "How many people cared?" Silence. "I spent months believing nobody would." A pause. "Turns out I was wrong." The Marine nodded because Thomas wasn't alone. A lot of people had believed that. Grace, Arthur, Harold, others, people isolated by fear, convinced nobody would listen. Then somebody did, and everything changed. Thomas reached down. Resting one hand on Atlas's head, the shepherd leaned into the touch. Comfortable, trusted, family. The old mechanic smiled softly. "If this dog ever runs for mayor." A pause. "I'm voting for him." Caleb laughed. Atlas opened one eye, then closed it again. Entirely unimpressed by politics, the three of them sat together watching the sunset. The mountains, the valley, the town, home, real home. And for the first time since walking through the doors of Willow Creek Recovery Home, Caleb felt something he hadn't expected to find there. Peace. Peace lasted longer than Caleb expected, longer than anyone expected. Months passed, then more. Life settled into routines, healthy routines, the kind built on trust rather than fear. Willow Creek no longer felt like a prison disguised as a care facility. It felt like a community, a real one. Residents laughed more, families visited more, staff turnover decreased. New programs appeared, gardens expanded, the library reopened. The woodworking shop Thomas loved became one of the most popular activities in the facility, and somehow through all of it, Atlas remained at the center. The old German shepherd never asked for attention, never demanded it. Yet people naturally gravitated toward him, because Atlas represented something: hope, safety, the feeling that somebody was watching out for you. Many residents had spent years feeling forgotten. Atlas changed that. A simple visit from him could brighten an entire day. One autumn afternoon, nearly a year after Caleb first walked through Willow Creek's doors, a dedication ceremony took place. Nobody told Caleb about it beforehand, which should have been his first warning. The moment he saw rows of chairs arranged in the courtyard, he became suspicious. The moment he saw Grace smiling, he became concerned. The moment he saw Ryan trying not to smile, he knew he was trapped. "You people are planning something." Grace looked innocent, a terrible sign. "We have no idea what you're talking about." Arthur Walker laughed immediately, which ruined the performance. Residents gathered throughout the courtyard. Families filled additional chairs. Local reporters arrived. Even the mayor showed up. Caleb looked around, then toward Thomas. The old mechanic seemed unusually pleased with himself. "Another terrible sign." "What did you do?" Thomas smiled. "Nothing. A pause. That's how you know it wasn't me." The ceremony began shortly afterward. The new director of Willow Creek stepped forward. A kind woman named Melissa Grant, former nurse, former military spouse. The residents adored her. She adjusted the microphone, then looked toward the crowd. 1 year ago, this facility became the center of an investigation that changed lives. Silence spread across the courtyard. Everyone listened. The director continued. Many people helped expose the truth. A pause. Many people showed courage. Another. Many people refused to stay silent. Then she smiled. But one of them had 4 legs. Laughter spread through the crowd. Caleb immediately looked down. Atlas sat beside him, completely unaware. The director pointed toward a covered bronze plaque near the courtyard entrance. 2 children stepped forward, pulled away the cloth, and revealed the dedication. The Atlas courtyard. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then applause erupted. Residents stood, families stood, staff stood. Everyone. The old shepherd looked around in confusion, as if trying to determine why people suddenly lost their minds. Grace wiped tears from her eyes. Arthur clapped harder than anyone. Ryan laughed openly, and Thomas looked proud, really proud. The kind of pride fathers carried when words weren't enough. Caleb rested one hand on Atlas's shoulder. The German shepherd leaned against him, content, unaware that an entire courtyard now carried his name. That winter brought another surprise, a good one. Thomas received clearance to leave Willow Creek permanently. The announcement arrived after months of therapy, months of recovery, months of work. The old mechanic still needed occasional assistance, still attended medical appointments, still moved slower than before, but he was ready. Ready to live independently again. The news spread quickly. Residents celebrated. Staff celebrated. Grace organized a farewell party before anyone could stop her. The former principal treated event planning like a military operation. Resistance was futile. The party attracted nearly everyone in the facility. Even former residents returned. Harold made the trip from Utah. Arthur prepared a speech. Nobody allowed him to finish it, mostly because he cried halfway through. Then everyone else started crying too, including people who claimed they weren't emotional, including Ryan again. The deputy continued blaming allergies. Nobody believed him. The following spring, Thomas moved into a small house on the edge of Pine Hollow. Nothing extravagant, just comfortable, a place with a porch, a workshop, a garden, everything he wanted. Caleb helped with the move, so did half the town, apparently saying no wasn't an option. By sunset, the house looked lived in. Warm, welcoming, home. The old mechanic stood on the porch looking across the valley, then smiled. "Not bad." Caleb nodded. "Not bad." Atlas settled beside a rocking chair, claiming his territory immediately. Professional as always, Thomas laughed. "Looks like he approves." The shepherd thumped his tail once. Approval confirmed. As time continued moving forward, the Crestview scandal slowly faded from headlines. New stories replaced old ones. News cycles moved on. They always did. But Pine Hollow didn't forget. Neither did Willow Creek. Because for the people who lived through it, the story wasn't about corruption, or investigations, or courtrooms. It was about something much simpler. People mattered. Every person mattered. No matter their age, no matter their health, no matter how easy the world found it to overlook them. That lesson remained. Long after reporters left, long after trials ended, long after the headlines disappeared, and every time someone walked through the Atlas courtyard, they remembered. One evening, nearly 2 years after everything began, Caleb sat on Thomas's porch watching the sunset. The sky burned orange above the mountains. The air smelled of pine. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Atlas rested nearby. His muzzle showed more gray now, a lot more. Age continued moving forward, as it always did. The old shepherd slept deeply, comfortably, peacefully. Thomas sat beside his son, both men watching the horizon. Neither needing to speak, eventually the old mechanic broke the silence. "You know," Caleb looked over, Thomas smiled, "when you first came to Willow Creek." A pause. "I thought you were just visiting." Another. "I had no idea you were about to start a war." The Marine laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came easily these days. "Neither did I," Thomas nodded, then looked toward Atlas. The old shepherd slept through the conversation, completely unconcerned. The old mechanic smiled softly. "Good thing he did." Caleb followed his gaze toward the dog. Toward the partner who noticed something wrong before anyone else. Toward the loyal friend who never stopped protecting people, even after retirement, even after service, even after everything. The sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. Darkness settled across the valley. Lights appeared throughout Pine Hollow. Warm lights, home lights. The kind that reminded people they belonged somewhere. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Thomas quietly said, "We got lucky." Caleb thought about that, then slowly shook his head. "No." The old mechanic raised an eyebrow. "No." The Marine looked toward Atlas, then toward the town. Then toward the life they'd helped save. "We paid attention." Silence followed, the kind that comes when everyone understands. And as night settled over Pine Hollow, Caleb Ward realized something important. The investigation had never really been about exposing corruption. It had been about protecting people. The people nobody else was protecting, and sometimes that was enough to change everything.